This is Upwell, a new podcast from only.one, featuring entrepreneurs, advocates, and leaders working to protect and restore the ocean and the planet. And I'm your host, Aaron Kinnery. Today we have Ian Urbina, founder of the Outlaw Ocean Project and a longtime investigative reporter covering stories about human rights, environment, and labor concerns at sea. Let's dive in. Ian, thanks for joining Upwell. For some context, I was hoping you might first start by giving a sense of scope of the area in which you cover, both in terms of geographic scale as well as how many people are involved in the industry.
It's a pretty broad terrain. So we focus on the watery 2/3 of the planet. By that, I mean human rights, labor, environmental stories that unfold offshore. Most of our reporting focuses on international waters or the high seas, but sometimes the stories we cover are in national waters. But we really try to focus on that realm. And numbers vary, but 50 to 55 million people work offshore. Most of those folks are on fishing vessels, but a good number are also merchant marine, and we focus on that population.
And what drew you to this area originally?
So it's sort of a long story. I mean, I was an anthropologist, cultural anthropologist before I became a journalist. And while I was doing my doctoral work, I took some time off for my dissertation and ended up working on a ship. And I became fixated very much through an anthropological lens, if you will, with the workers who exist in this odd universe. So I was, enamored and fascinated by the space, the sea, but I didn't grow up on ships or have any real fluency in that realm. But when I did spend time around fishing workers and seafarers, I just kind of became fixated with them as a sort of diaspora, transient tribe of people that are, have their own laws and lore and humor and kind of relationship with time and space, and yet we very rarely hear from them. So all those things together drew me to that demographic.
And over your years of reporting, are there any individuals in particular that really stand out?
Wow, that's a tough question. I mean, I think what stands out are trips to places and groups of people within that realm as opposed to any singular characters. I mean, there are colorful characters for sure. Rebecca Gomberts, who provides abortions offshore in places where, to women that are and girls who are in countries where it's very illegal and sometimes deadly. She's quite a character. I spent quite some time with Max Hardberger, who's a professional repo man who steals ships on behalf of mortgage lenders and banks, and he's quite a character. The Bates family, who created their own micronation offshore. So there are some funky characters out there, but the rest of the people that made an impact on me are groups of people. So the deckhands in general on several dozen Thai fishing vessels that over the course of multiple trips to the South China Sea that I met. These are boys from the age of 15 up to men of the age of 50, who many of whom have been trafficked, and just that general niche workforce really left an impression on me.
And you founded the Outlaw Ocean Project to advance this work. What's the mission of the organization?
We're a journalism organization, first and foremost, in many ways akin to the Marshall Project or the ProPublica, sort of a small boutique journalism nonprofit. So we produce stories. We abide by all the sort of standard journalistic rules. We're not an advocacy group, but we try to do investigative stories that really reveal dark things.
Your reporting often goes beyond instances of crime, and you explore what you called this vanishingly thin line between civilization and the lack of it. What did you mean by this? Can you unpack this a little bit?
I mean, I view the offshore realm as a frontier, sort of in a liminal space, an edge. It's a huge realm, and a lot of people actually work out there, and a lot happens out there. But it's existentially different than most other places on the planet because it's out of reach of government authority. Even when there are rules, those rules are on paper mostly because there isn't actually a police force that enforces them. All this adds up to, in my view, the thought that the best way to analyze this place and the people who are there is as a generally lawless frontier, which is not to say that all that happens there is bad. It's to say that much of what happens there is extra legal. So you have vigilante conservationists who are fighting the good fight often, but they're doing so at the edge or beyond the line of law. And you have people doing human slavery and arms trafficking and dumping of oil and murder and all sorts of bad things. And they're getting they're doing it with impunity because it's on the other side of the law. And so sort of if you explore this universe as we have for a decade, I think it's true to say that you're not learning just about a place, you're also learning about a frontier in human nature, sort of the outer edge of how we as humans behave when we're given the liberty of being beyond the reach of rules. And sometimes we behave well and sometimes we behave poorly, but I do feel like the place gives you an unusual window on that line between civilization or governance and the lack of it.
What does it mean to be a vigilante conservationist? I know you had some experiences with a few.
I mean, Sea Shepherd is this organization that was born a bunch of decades ago as a spin-off out of Greenpeace, sort of animated by the notion that Greenpeace was not direct action enough, aggressive enough, daring enough to get the job done. And so Sea Shepherd wanted to be more aggressive. And they have a fleet of ships, and they describe themselves as, vigilante conservationists, which is to say, in a realm, the high seas, where governments are not actually enforcing the law, they're there to try to do so. And that's what makes them vigilantes in some cases, not always. It's not their only defining feature, but in the lack of true enforcement, they're there trying to force enforcement. And how they do that, historically in whale wars, they were ramming ships and being really aggressive. They've toned that down a fair amount, and now they're doing other sorts of tactics, but they're always at the edge of the law that are trying to leverage media and public awareness and obstructionism. And Greenpeace engages in direct action too. There's a long, proud history of civil disobedience that's outside the law, whether it's sitting on buses where you're not supposed to or occupying intersections and blocking traffic. This is civil disobedience. It's illegal, and you're doing it for a point. These folks are just doing it offshore.
In addition to some of the human rights violations, what are some of the biggest environmental threats that are emerging in the high seas?
I think the biggest threat, obviously, the backdrop of everything is the climate crisis, and that plays out pretty intensely at sea in multiple ways. Temperature rise and acidification being two of them. But plastic pollution is a climate crisis problem too, because it's part of the same parent, which is the fossil fuel industry. Plastics come from fossil extraction, and so it's all still part of the same thing. And the oceans are facing a real crisis of pollution of many sorts, including plastic. I think the biggest threat is overfishing, and often that's legal overfishing. So to put it plainly, the oceans are rapidly running out of fish, marine life, and 90% of the world's stocks are at the edge or beyond the edge of collapsing. And that's just because this industry, mostly the distant water fishing industry, much of it legal and licensed, have just never really been kept within sustainable bounds. And so they're pulling too much marine life out of the water, and the waters can't keep up. I think that's one of the biggest crises. And if the oceans become deserts, watery deserts, and they don't have marine life, that has huge planetary and existential repercussions, because huge part of the carbon capture and temperature control and 50% of the oxygen we breathe gets cleaned by the oceans. These key planetary functions that are provided by the ocean, they don't work if there's no life in the ocean. The carbon capture goes away, the cleaning of oxygen goes away, the temperature stabilization goes away. So overfishing is hand in glove connected to the climate crisis.
You recently launched the Outlaw Ocean Podcast, a 7-part series exploring the lawlessness realm of the high seas. And I just wanted to discuss a few of those episodes. The first episode in the series starts with a murder video of 4 men being killed at sea. And as you start reporting on this, you end up over multiple years in what's become known as the maritime merry-go-round. What is that?
It's a glamorized way to refer to a more acute version of what I think all investigative reporters, regardless of topic, run into, which is diversion, from sources who don't want to answer questions, the targets of investigations who duck and bob and evade. But it's distinctly vexing in the maritime space because very little journalism aimed at the maritime space occurs. And so those folks are not used to getting hard questions or even feeling any duty to answer them. And B, the very nature of how much of the fishing industry, especially, but maritime in general, has historically been set up is more to protect privacy of the stakeholders than it is to actually enable law enforcement. And so in the very kind of fabric of how information resides in this industry, it's really tough to figure out basic things. Some people die. Who's responsible? Who ordered the killings? Who are the victims in the water? Who owns the ships? Who's profiting from those ships? Who should be held accountable? What government should investigate? These are pretty straightforward questions, whether you're investigating a murder in the Amazon jungle or south side of Chicago or 1,000 miles off the coast of Argentina. And in the maritime space, they're pretty tough to pin down.
And the episode also discusses how the threat of Somali piracy led to militarization and violence on the high seas and sometimes is even used in the cover-up. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I mean, piracy, think back, Captain Phillips, the Hollywood movie, the height of Somali piracy ran 2007, 2008 to 2012. That's when real numbers of ships were getting taken and the world was in a crisis. And, because of various historical reasons, namely governments have long since shrunk their navies and also sort of embraced the notion that the high seas should really be an unfettered throughway for commerce. And we can all agree, we being governments, historically all agreed that we should just protect that freedom of passage. And that's how we have globalized, efficiencies. I think, because the high seas have this special status, as a commercial highway, where adding tolls to it, adding rules on it, has been something that in the last 3 decades has been central to how our global economy is developed. What that's meant is that governments are very reluctant to send out guys with guns and try to police other nations' waters or the high seas. And so when Somali piracy kicked up, no one was equipped legally or, in terms of guns and steel. And so they turned to the private sector and said, you guys, figure something out, protect your own ships. And private maritime security emerged. And now jump, a decade later, Somali piracy has kind of declined. Their piracy in other places is still pretty hot. But throughout that period, you could say I was attacked by pirates and get away with murder. It was a very easy cover for more or less anything that went down because it was a real threat and no one had the ability to check whether what you were saying is true or those really Somali pirates. And in the case of the murder investigation that we looked into, the initial response from the ship owners and the governments that we went after first was that the guys in the water were Somali pirates or pirates of some sort. That turned out to be completely false.
One more question on this episode. What's TrigMac tracking and how has technology been used for better tracking and investigations?
TrigMac tracking is this small Norwegian investigative firm that does really, really good forensic analysis. They are a private firm, nonprofit. They work for clients. The clients are typically governments that want to figure out how to better police their waters. Sometimes TrigMac tracking is hired to do specific investigations of specific incidents, like this murder video. Other times they're just hired by the government of Ghana or Gambia, or Taiwan, to help advise them on how they can better ensure that they're not complicit in illegality by opening their ports to sketchy players. And Trick-Mac tracking helps. Trick-Mac tracking is also public-facing in the sense that they work with journalists like my organization and lots of others to sort of help lawyers, advocates, journalists, companies better figure out questions about their supply chain, questions about whether this crime might connect with a product that they sell, these sorts of things.
Episode 5 explores your reporting in Gambia, where Chinese fleets were depleting the local waters in search of fish to use for fish meal. How has this fish meal production and the Golden Lead factory impacted the local community?
So fish meal just definitionally is this funky thing that a lot of people eat and don't realize it. Fish meal essentially is feed. It's not food, right? So it's feed for livestock. Livestock that eat fish meal tend to be chickens, pigs, and farm-raised fish, aquaculture. And they're pellets or powder that is essentially just ground up wild-caught fish pulled out of the ocean, ground up, pureed, dried, and turned into these high-protein pellets. Now, fish meal matters because huge masses of marine life are being pulled out of the ocean for this feed. And it matters because it's a very inefficient way to handle marine life, using it in this fashion. If you're going to argue for seafood, well, you have a better leg to stand on because people eat that stuff. But if you're going to argue for depleting the oceans for the sake of feeding other things that people then may eat, it gets a little bit unsustainable. And that's the problem of fish meal. In Gambia, you have a place in the planet, the West African coast, so Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia. You have upwards of 40 fish meal plants, most of them Chinese-owned. And you have this power disparity where you've got underdeveloped, fairly unsavvy political leaders, cash desperate, aiming for building schools and roads and protecting against COVID and whatnot. So they need revenue to run their country, and they're signing deals with these factory owners that are often questionable. And they're also giving away licenses, selling licenses to these industrial foreign vessels that come into their waters and rake them clean. And in Gambia, the bonga fish is just one concrete example of, a bunch of foreign vessels, mostly Chinese, in Gambian waters that are taking this one type of fish out of the water. This is a type of fish that used to be a staple for Gambians, and now the price is better if you're a fisherman to sell that bonga to the factory and, in the fish meal factory rather than selling it to local consumption. And so all this protein is getting routed to fish meal as opposed to getting routed to one of the poorest, communities on the planet, namely Gambians. That's the concern.
And this is devastating because fish accounts for about 50% of the country's animal protein intake, right? And so now you've got local Gambians who can't afford the fish that are in their own waters.
Yeah, and also, so instead they're buying chicken that's imported from China and it's often shot up with antibiotics. So just from a health perspective, it's just from a climate perspective, just think of the carbon footprint of growing a fish that you feed fish meal to, then shipping it all the way from China, freezing it, and then feeding it to Gambians, as opposed to just eating the bonga fish that came right out of their coast. Like from a carbon point, from a health point, from a domestic food security point of view, all these points of view, this kind of economy doesn't make any sense. It's utterly unsustainable for Gambians or the planet.
And it's pretty significant. I didn't realize until I'm diving into some of your reporting, 30% of all marine life pulled from sea feeds other fish and aquaculture farms. So this whole system is pretty absurd, it seems.
And that number has gone down, so I think it's closer to 20% now, 17%. It's still a huge number. The amount of fish meal heading into aquaculture is going down. Now, the untold story is the amount of fish going onto chicken farms, is still pretty high because there hasn't been journalistic attention on that specific supply chain. But either way, even the 20% fish meal number is just insane.
In the final episode, you reflect on how fishermen experience these incredibly harsh conditions, and yet they're often eager to return to sea. And then you continue on to discuss how grueling it's been for you personally and physically, emotionally. And yet you also find yourself longing to be back in the arena. What do you think drives this connection and kinship, both for you personally and for folks broadly?
Well, for me personally, I think there's a negative and a positive fuel source. One, the positive is it's a fascinating, riveting place, and both the people and the sheer geography. And that pulls me back. So that's the positive force that is addictive. The negative force is the more depravity and brutality and dark problems you see or I see, the more I feel a certain commitment to and a certain guilt, quite bluntly, at the disparity between my comfortable middle-class life and what I'm witnessing. And that guilt motivates me to try harder, to do more of the reporting, and in some small way, perhaps, contribute to helping alleviate what I'm seeing. And so every time I go back, that negative fuel restocks because I see dark stuff and I'm like, okay, I really got to write more and to report more and go back and tell more stories because there's just not enough happening out there, and there's a lot of stuff happening that needs to be covered.
And I want to dive more into the details and the dynamics of that reporting. I wonder if you could share the level of time and investment that goes into a long-form investigative story or series. How long are you reporting? Where are you doing it from? What's involved in some of the day-to-day work?
Well, I mean, on the far extreme, it's a timely question because I just got out of a staff meeting. I have 8 full-time folks, 4 or 5 part-time folks. We've been working on an investigation for over 3 years now. That reporting, took me offshore near the Falkland Islands, offshore to the high seas near the Galapagos Islands, offshore near the North Korean, South Korean sea border, all over the place, and sometimes multiple trips. Each of those trips will take short as 3 weeks, sometimes 6, 7 weeks. And that's just the at-sea reporting. The desk reporting is years, so these sorts of we try not to, we're not beat reporters. We're not ocean beat reporters. We're not trying to be first and fast. We're trying to be slow and best if we can. I don't know that we always succeed, but our goal is to sort of produce the story that someone might say, okay, if you want to read one thing about this topic, read this one. It builds on prior reporting, but so yeah, some investigations take, multiple years. This investigation probably costs $600,000 to produce, and, all in. Shorter ones like Libya last year, we did something intense on the Mediterranean that took about a year to produce and cost $200,000-300,000. And, it was a heavy lift, but not compared to the China investigation we're doing now. So that's the range, at least a year, maybe longer.
And a big focus of your work is not just on the reporting side, but also distribution strategies to reach both younger audiences and international audiences. Can you talk about this approach a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so I was at the New York Times for 17 years and, loved the place and, learned everything I know from that teaching hospital, if you will. But one of the things that motivated me to leave and create my own shop is I wanted to try some new daring things with distribution. I think there's a lot of innovation when it comes to how you report stories and what content you use, open source and cell phone footage, and how you present them and narrative structure and all these things. There's lots of real stuff happening in that realm, but how you then get it out and who you're getting it out to, I don't think there's as much good thought happening in experimentation. And I think if you're at The Economist or, the Washington Post, you're producing a written or a video piece, it's in English and it's probably aimed at 5% of the population in one country. And I thought, if you really want to make change on these things, you probably need to aim at a bigger portion of the pie, young people, non-English, and folks who aren't getting their news by traditional news, written video sources. So that, okay, well, how could we do that with what we're doing? And so we've experimented with music and recruited a whole bunch of musicians to help us access their listeners and get them interested in the reporting we're doing. We then moved from music to murals and have done a lot of work globally with muralists. We're trying to ramp up a video game project, a global video game project. Podcast in some ways is part of the same experimentation, although it's not that daring or new. But that was part of the... And then, a huge part of what we do is just the written story. If you're looking at Libya, that piece was 10,000 words, ran in the New Yorker. But we then spent an extra 2 months and a bunch of budget to translate it into 10 languages and then get all these venues elsewhere, Le Monde Diplomatique in Paris and El País in Spain and Global and all these other, we bring it to them for free and say, hey, look, this is really good content. You can have it for free. We've already translated it. Would you put us on your channels? And that takes a lot of work, but it makes the difference between a story that might get 1 million readers to a story that gets 40 million, which is where we are with Libya, and 40 million interesting folks in other places that matter.
Yeah, it's a big gap that we see also in the philanthropic and advocacy space, and one that we're trying to continue to work through as well, which is over the past, decade or so, there's been more investment in storytelling and the power of storytelling to advance a cause or an issue. But there's more focus on the development of the content. The distribution continues to lack. And so I think it's terrific, the amount of different places that you're reaching through this distribution strategy is great. I know that you're focused on the storytelling and the journalism, but oftentimes this has led to action afterwards. Can you just maybe share a couple examples? I know, for example, in that first episode, the captain who ordered the killing was ultimately convicted.
Yeah, I mean, if you pull this helicopter up for a second to altitude and think about outcomes, for me, I think about outcomes and impact in a couple different frames. One is a lot of people, and the second is, crassly put, important people, and the third is people deeply. And so if we're trying to affect a lot of people, important people, and people deeply, all right, so a lot of people, journalists have some metrics, but they're kind of shoddy. Are you getting a lot of people to read your stuff or see your movie or whatever? And that's where some of the stuff we talked about, like getting at a lot of people through creative means of getting them gimmicks, admittedly gimmicks to get them onto the story and bringing your overall consumption numbers up. Important people, by that I mean trying to get key stakeholders who have power to change stuff, lawmakers and lawyers and NGO heads and these actors, cultural figures to take up the issue. Those are amplifiers that really bring a lot of impact, and aiming at those folks is important too, specifically. And then people deeply is sort of its own thing, which is average folk or important, quote unquote, important folk, but really getting them in a deep way. And so we try to always assess our impact through all three lenses. We're doing well on a lot of people because of the strategies. Important people, you see concrete, targeted, the prison, just examples, like the captain who ordered the killings that we investigated for 7 years, he gets charged and convicted and put away. That's an accomplishment, as dark as it is to say that. The prison that was the focal point of our Libya investigation. Within 30 days of the piece coming out, it was closed down. These are concrete outcomes. Do they solve the problem? No, they just moved all those detainees to some other facility. So you want to be sober about measuring your impact. But we have a lot. Lang Long, a guy that we focused on early was shackled by the neck, Cambodian guy. His life was fundamentally changed by his willingness to give me his story. Now he has job training and a place to live, and so that's really important. And then I'm jumping around, but the measure of, are you affecting average people in a deep way? The only way I've found to really chart that is watching your inbox and reading the stuff that comes in and just sort of assessing, that's the only way you end up hearing. And the podcast, interestingly, opened up a lot more inflow of that kind of stuff. People were really moved by the podcast, and they wrote these really touching, substantive, thoughtful notes about what it made them feel and think. And that checks that third box for me.
Last question. How would the broader climate movement benefit from more investigative journalism?
Well, hugely. I think, like, again, you're asking me, and it's my, profession. So, but I think investigative journalism done well provides light in dark places, and it does so in a responsible fashion that, while stopping short of advocacy, it does nonetheless offer some hints at where someone might go and what they might do to fix that issue. I think that's, to my view, what investigative journalism is supposed to do. And so it's partially explanatory in its big reveal and its prosecutorial bent. That's the dream of what I aim to do. And ideally also I try to make it narrative. So it's not articles, which I did for most of my career. It's stories, because that's how you really get people to stay with you, is if there's a narrative, there's a character, and they travel. You do all that stuff, you can get real impact. And whether your issue is, really trying to get the world to think more practically about weaning themselves from fossil fuels, or getting the philanthropic community to realize that we might want to save the planet, but if we ignore 2/3 of it, we're not going to succeed. And there needs to be more investment in journalism and solutions and protection at sea if we're going to deal with the climate crisis. All these things are what journalism can do.
Well, thank you, Ian. I'm really grateful for you committing your time and talent to cover this important issue and for sharing your experience with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Ian, for sharing insights from your years of reporting at sea. I'll leave links to where you can find Ian and the Outlaw Ocean Project and podcast in the show notes, which you can find at only.one/Upwell. Once again, that's only.one/Upwell. This week's episode was engineered by Jake Bowles, research was supported by Serena Cooper, and our cover art was designed by Joanna Marcus at only.one. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and start your journey to help save the ocean and fix the climate today at only.one. For as little as $9, you can start planting coral and mangroves and removing plastics and carbon. Again, that's www.only.one. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back next week with an all-new episode of Upwell.